My name is Ishani Mukherjee. I am Associate Professor of Public Policy at the School of Social Sciences at SMU. So sustainability policies are critical for governments and businesses in Asia because these two represent the two biggest organizations or two biggest category of organizations that will be detrimental to how successfully we can meet our climate ambitions, both in Asia as well as globally. According to reports by the World Meteorological Organization, last year in Asia, we actually suffered quite a lot of damages. We suffered about $35.6 billion in damages, and this is in Asia alone. These damages include damages caused not just to infrastructure and not just to water and transport issues, but also to entire livelihoods of people who have been the victims of climatic events over 1 year. The number of people impacted is yet another staggering statistic that comes. There's 50 million people were affected directly by environmental climatic events over in 1 year in Asia. So what these numbers tell us are that a lot depends on how much policies should be better planned before we reach events that cause unplanned damages. And so the role of the government and businesses are to work hand in hand in order to come up with scalable, replicable, and long-term solutions to climate problems, and not just look at short-term projects for short-term gains. So overall, we can see that the world is behind on reducing and managing emissions. At the same time, it's also dealing with a suite of other interlinked issues such as electricity access, access to infrastructure, sustainable transport and water, and all of these have witnessed a mixed bag of accomplishments in Asia. Globally, efforts are about 50% short of 2030 emissions targets, and finance has been a significant bottleneck in developing solutions at scale. So there are efforts to push more blended finance mechanisms, and this is something that indicates financial policy instruments wherein government or public funds go towards stimulating more private sector investment. And these are good examples of sustainability policies that implicate both governments as well as businesses in Asia. For example, recently the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, has recently announced a $5 million Asia Climate Solutions Design Grant that is supposed to be a funding scheme focused directly on providing financing for conducting pilots and feasibility analyses of new blended finance mechanisms in key sectors in Asia, such as nature-based solutions, new climate mitigation and adaptation technologies. These kind of instruments actually help towards creating an enabling environment that gives the right signals for investing in these solutions in Asia. This is a tough question, simply because of the rapidly shifting realities of the environment, the changing landscape of sustainability technologies, and all of this is happening in the face of great global disruptions such as war and pandemics. Another sobering realization is that the science of climate change, or the climate crisis rather, alerts us that there are tipping points in our future where environmental degradation and damages can become irreversible. Furthermore, the interlinkages and interdependent nature of sustainability sectors in Asia mean that we need to see more and lasting and better partnerships emerging, not just between governments and businesses, but also close partnerships need to proliferate between business, NGOs, academics, civil society organizations, and the government to translate climate ambition from paper into action, and urgently do so. Climate change problems and those of sustainability are as global as they are multifaceted, and so must their solutions be. So we need enabling policies that are not myopic in what they target and are instead designed to meet multiple objectives across sectors to implement solutions at scale. So deliberate creation of multi-policy mixes to address multi-objectives is at the heart of policy design. So policy design is a way in which we study how governments formulate multi-pronged, multi-level policy responses by gauging how they first articulate accurately complex policy goals such as those of sustainability and climate change. And then secondly, employ problem-solving processes to design means to meet those goals. So policy design is essentially about policy problem solving. So how do you frame environmental challenges, knowing it might not be the primary objective for multiple countries and multiple jurisdictions? Well, one kind of approach that helps us with this kind of thinking is multi-objective approaches that acknowledge that we are not just solving one problem, but need to satisfice across multiple problems. For example, while looking at greenhouse gases, governments are also simultaneously concerned about jobs, about financing, energy security, and these might all be in play at the same time. So a policy design lens helps to inform multi-criteria decision analysis perspectives that supports frameworks dealing with multiple objectives at the same time. Simultaneously, a policy design perspective moves away from this idea of one problem, one policy, or one objective, one instrument, and supports the idea of multiple policy tools working together in policy packages or toolboxes to meet the complex interrelated problems of climate change. So, policy design is about recognizing that we are going to need to push multiple buttons at the same time, and knowing full well that while there may very well be synergies among some things and some sectors, for example, air pollution and congestion in cities go hand in hand when we think about them, but there may actually be trade-offs. For example, bio-based fuels and the need to grow green energy feedstock using intensive agriculture to shift away from fossil fuels. Which ill do you choose and why? And these trade-offs can have a temporal element, and that is addressed by policy design thinking, whereby what is needed to be done in the short run on the ground as a social objective may not immediately meet a broader climate policy goal, but needs to be considered as countries in the developing world, and especially in Asia, transition over to low carbon development and systemic decarbonization. So co-production in public policy and public management broadly defines the range of practices that enable citizens and members of the public like you and I to be actively involved and engaged in public service delivery, implementation, as well as during policy deliberations about, what are we going to do. So these programs capture the spirit of collaborative governance and can take various forms, such as policy labs that go beyond just one-way public feedback mechanisms. The climate problem and the problem of sustainability is something called a super wicked problem. And this is to quote my mentor and colleague, Professor Benjamin Cashore. And it is one that requires action at all scales, global to individual. And so collaborative governance and active participation of the public in policymaking becomes really important in this sense. As one of the defining problems of our time, climate change also presents an internal battle with ourselves about how do we change our own behaviors as we both emit carbon and affect the environment, but also want to improve it. Secondly, behavior change in terms of industry, households, and individuals also has to do with how intrinsically do we value environmental endowments. Is it just about having a price marker for natural resources, water, clean air? Or is it a deeper relationship, a deeper value that we ascribe and that cannot be fully captured in a set price? Also, the response of the public to different policy instruments can be quite diverse. So there's no one way to think about participation or compliance. And so we need to go beyond just looking at incentives and disincentives and really understanding the complex ways in which people engage with policy. And that can go a long way in designing effective policy tools for sustainability in Asia. So there can be a significant divide between how scientific knowledge about climate change and the environment and the policies that are devised surrounding them are created. And this is pronounced in Asia because we deal with multiple ecosystems, we deal with multiple environmental scenarios. And so sometimes there can be a mismatch between the science of environmental change and climate change and how we design policies to manage and mitigate against risks. At the same time, there needs to be a concerted acknowledgement that the crises that we see unfolding before us today are bigger than what we may have anticipated before, and that we must not let this wedge grow between the scientific knowledge and what needs to be done policy-wise. Secondly, governments need to help mobilize market capital and private sector investments in renewable energy and decarbonization commitments, because the energy sector is the biggest hammer that we have to attack the climate change problem. And so decarbonization commitments are energy driven, and these commitments by industry are currently untapped because we don't have concurrently supporting energy efficiency efforts on the part of governments. And so we need to design policies that are designed to coordinate action and work together on both the demand and the supply side of sustainability. In terms of what policies have been the most effective so far and why, well, climate ambitions in Asia and specifically Asia-Pacific economies have grown notably over the last 2 years or so, as an increasing number of jurisdictions and industries have made net zero pledges, and these have helped define big macro-level policy goals and targets in more specific terms than they were being articulated previously. That being said, there are still challenges at the more on-the-ground implementation level. So while we have policy signals, at on-the-ground implementation level of things, there might be quite a bit of a gap. So the significance of COP27 to Asia is actually quite a bit. I would like to emphasize here that there isn't, again, one effective policy or one particular exemplary policy instrument that will define what sustainability looks like in Asia. So talking out the possibilities is what is happening right now in COP27. So setting big policy signals is important, but we need to see concrete mobilization of action-driven frameworks. And COP27 is this regular window of opportunity that takes place every year to discuss these possibilities. For example, loss and damage compensation has been high on the agenda of the COP this year. And it's the first time that this issue has been on the agenda of any conference of parties for climate change. And for countries, including those in Asia that have had or are facing irreparable damages from climate change and who fall through the cracks in mitigation versus adaptation only discussions, this is a very important platform to be in. South Asia, for example, has been pretty vocal about this. Pakistan, as you know, is still dealing with the aftermath of devastating floods. And as the chair of the G77 group, which is comprised of over 130 developing countries at the UN, it has succeeded in helping to put loss and damage on the climate agenda for the first time ever in the history of COPs. And so this is a very big achievement in my mind. Southeast Asia is also vulnerable to climatic events, and some countries have also vocalized their support for loss and damage. Well, I have 3 points of wisdom for these various actors looking to attain climate change goals at the policy level. Firstly, I think being more action-driven rather than discourse-centric is very important. It is critical to front-load climate investments and actions, and this means to do today what you think only needs to be done tomorrow. Because indeed, as the science will tell us, time is running out. Which brings me to my second point, that you have to engage more with climate science. And the science policy divide that has otherwise marked environmental policy thus far has to be reconciled more urgently today than ever before. Lastly, social equality, equity, and inclusivity in climate and sustainability policy action should be prioritized, because that can eventually make or break how sustainable these policies are.